Okay, we will start, and anyone else who will join us are more than free to join us here. We have more places here to sit. Good evening to everyone. I'm very glad to talk about the translation of a book. What we have here now, it's a book which was actually written more than 30 years ago, and since very beginning, when we start to talk about the activity of our program, and when I start to talk with Chris, it was immediately appeared the question why the book should be translated, and I try to actually first to face it even to ourselves as a collective who is actually dealing project-based, and to relate it into the past time when the book has come out. And it was a question of several segments and several aspects. I would like to focus now just on a question of organizing people together. And specifically because Kuda at the moment working several parallel projects, which deals also with organizing people in a housing problem and also in a field of culture and artistically named. And I'm very glad, and we have something then we can share, especially because all of us here, I mean, and mostly our people are coming from some kind of, creativity and some creative work. And it's something that we could actually share in between each of us. And we find it very, very viable to open again these questions of organizing and this difficult question when the people actually decided to work together, and how this process could develop in this relationship. Why the people actually start to work in a group? Why the people actually, and how they deal in between each of other, all these questions of surviving, existential things, and also political, agenda, and then the route. So all these questions are still, more than valuable for us. And specifically, I try to in conversation with Chris, I try to focus on very specific transformation of what's happened in Serbia, and in the process of so-called transition, which is hardly changed the circumstances and everyday life circumstances where we are living now, and it's changed the agenda of surviving and organizing, and existential, parts. So through this, I tried actually to find it doesn't really matter. Then it's these particular examples come from the music, and we find it as a very useful, part, using the music for the whole this event as a strong metaphor. But basically, it's a question of joint work, basically. And even this event, it comes from the collaborative network as well. I mean, it's a new circumstances in a 21st century, but it also comes from the network of people who actually recognize each other, trying to through this process of project-based communication to share some values. And then that's the way how we actually connect, and how we met all of those people who are mostly collaborators and people who are playing with us and on this festival on opposition. And in this process, more than 10 years, we struggling, understanding how it's difficult to find all these solutions of changing the policy and culture, specifically in Europe, and how it's developed through the open calls and commissions and all other stuff. So it's how it deals, and how it's also reflect on the national levels in the states, and where it's coming up, and how it's transformed the support, basic support for art production. So just because of this, then it's a major, scale of strong transformation in culture industry, and in now call it Creative Europe as a basic platform for culture policy in European Union, which is strongly focused on manifestation, on festivals, on kind of, big stages, transform kind of cultural value to share with the citizens. But in general, I mean, it's a far away than the particular question of how artists could be able to really protect, and in the question of artistic production itself. And I mean, in March we have one workshop already worked with Chris, and Chris actually shared with us really interesting questions about how was in the time and how it works with Henry Cow band, traveling, organizing, sharing, and all these processes what they actually go through, and all these problems what they have. And I think I really appreciate this, what we actually get it in a direct context of these processes. What is really comes up for us, it's still very, open question for just shifting in a present time. And in that organizational level, I tried, and I find it extremely important to put in this question. And why we actually find it, going through the book, we could find some basic scale. I mean, what Chris produced. He's opening the book with the first chapter, putting as a basic, paradigm and some thesis, and closing with a very final one. And with this conclusion, it's actually something that we find it extremely important today, still. And specifically, if we compare with some aspects of market aspects, which is more visible and more understandable in Serbian condition at the moment, where we actually just float at the moment. And I'm very happy then having all of you as our collaborators, even then a bigger crew of people who being with us more than 3 years, then Howard Slater, then Anthony Ayres, and then the friends who has actually joined us in this event, and Paul and Cara, and I'm actually asking to really join in this conversation, all of you, and then you're more than welcome, just to share then our own experience with the transformation, actually to understand the circumstances in which condition we are working and living now. And that is actually the main issue. Even then, this venue where we are sitting now, it also comes from the struggle and the questioning of, trying to create the space for production. And of course, then we can open another level, then how it's this such a independent space surviving in such a condition as Novi Sad and Serbian scene looks today. And I would like to start first of all, then I would like to introduce you to Ozren. Ozren was a translator of a book, but also Ozren is responsible for music programming in CK. This is also one level more than connecting the whole thing where we are actually meeting each other and why we are working this. And I would like just to jump in some aspects from your point of view, and then we can just continue.
Okay, I would say that I'm initial translator. We were just talking about. So here we are, like 31 years after initial publication of the book, and the way the book may resonate or someone's work, it can be also reflected on our situation. First we thought, okay, why do we want to translate? Do we need the book? Do we need it? And since some of us are not very good with English, then we always need to look at least through, some terms to see what are topics possible and to see whether it might be meaningful or not. And we thought, yes, it might be meaningful. Of course, it might be meaningful, especially because the very book is comprised of several essays made by artists, made by musicians, who is writing now theoretical and critical essays on music based on his own practice. Something that we thought we regard as very, very valuable and very important. So then we also, I'm not translator at all. This is my first effort, maybe the only one. So yes. So, but I think it does have some similarity with book, because I don't find book very much objective. Also, not tending to be objective, not tending to be in level of I would say possible academic discourse, but actually quite contrary. And yes, so the very method of creating this, translating the book was, I would say, maybe somehow similar with the very production of the book. Yes. So if I would give a word to Chris. So here we are, 31 years after first publication. You already, it's a known thing, you already referred to book with some kind of, not distance, but with cautious note that many things that are said are in premature form. But while listening to you yesterday, or even in March when we had first encounters, it's obvious that what was written here, given, it's actually a very good basis for even following your work nowadays. And so I think many, and as you said also, although cautious may be while reading, but many things probably still stand. So maybe if you could open for us, just for sake of also discussion, maybe to give us a little bit insight or input on the political climate of when this book was done, especially regarding to the problem of what is popular, what popular means in fields of music, and so on and so on. So.
Yeah. I wrote this book because I didn't write this book. I wrote the chapters that are in this book because it wasn't written as a book, it's a collection of writings. Because that's my nature. I need to think about things. I need to understand why I'm doing the things I do and why I take the attitude that I take to things. And I think that as somebody that's read a lot of academics writing about what people like me do, it's clear to me that they haven't the first idea of what really is going on. They're missing big chunks of information, and they are trying to reason from. Well, it's whistling. That's why. That's good. But, okay, but it's feeding back up there. Hey. Yeah. So I didn't find in the academic world what I considered to be an adequate account of what really goes on in the world of working musicians. And I think that it is useful, even if not definitive, that musicians themselves develop a theory about what they're doing and not leave it to academics to develop a theory about what we're doing, which comes from a completely different mode of thinking. They look at the surface of things and they try to see how it fits into the various philosophical, psychological, and sociological models that they understand. like the dogs in Franz Kafka's story who can't see human beings because they're missing this vital piece of information that their fellow dogs are rising in the air mysteriously, not because of some, they look for a reason. Why would this happen? And they find reasons. But what they don't see is that there's somebody there picking the dog up because they can't see human beings. Academics very often have this problem with real information, that there's some piece of information that they're missing because they're not actually involved in the process. And so they intellectualize their way around the problem, and they find good the whole problem with reason is that you can always give a good account of anything, however absurd it is. There's always, in the same as rhetoric, you can always make a case which makes the most unreasonable thing sound very reasonable. It's an unfortunate property of the human mind that we are almost, when we're pressed, incapable of saying, no, this is nonsense. Because we think, oh, actually that kind of makes sense to me. Yes, maybe Donald Trump isn't a complete lunatic. Perhaps there's something going on here that I don't understand. Everybody else seems to be taking Donald Trump very seriously. Maybe I'm missing something. No, you're not missing anything. So, for this reason, because I didn't find the ideas that I had about music expressed anywhere else, I took it upon myself to start putting my thoughts on paper, not with any idea of publication. The reason this book really came about was that in the late 70s, early 80s, a bunch of disaffected academics who wanted to study, who were studying popular music and who were being looked down their noses at, in other words, who were being, no, it's too colloquial. They wanted to study popular music. The academic community thought popular music is not a serious subject to study. You can't do Schenkerian analysis of popular music, therefore it's not serious. And they wanted to say, yes, no, it is serious. I mean, what they were really trying to do was to find their way into the academy. They wanted to be accepted, and they still wanted to study popular music. So they set up a small organization called the International Association for the Study of Popular Music, IASPM. It still exists. Now that they've become accepted into the mainstream, they don't need to play the game anymore, they are the game. But in this period, they were trying to, as part of their legitimation process, to suck in also musicians and practitioners and have a proper dialogue. And I wrote the central chapter of this book, Necessity and Choice in Musical Forms, for the first IASPM conference. That's why I wrote it. And writing it forced me to actually think about, what do I think about this? It's the same with the other question, what is popular music? Okay? This is also an IASPM conference topic. I would not have written that chapter if they hadn't said, we're all writing about this now. And I thought, okay, what do I actually think about this? And it always turns out that what I think about this is pretty much the opposite of what they think about it. And that made it interesting for me, and also, in the beginning, perhaps, interesting for them. So I had really no intention of writing a book, but I have every intention always of thinking about stuff and I am somebody who needs order. I can't do this thinking where you stay on the surface of things and you look at how things relate to each other on the surface, because that makes me feel nauseous, like seasickness. I need to have my feet on the ground. Somewhere I need to find where the ground is and get my feet there. And then I can build whatever theoretical notions I have, knowing that they're not just supporting each other. This is the problem with postmodern thinking. The thoughts are all supporting each other. No, the thoughts should be on the ground. And in case there are people here interested in linguistic theory, a small footnote, I'd like to say that a lot of these problems stem from the 60s infatuation with Ferdinand Saussure and his bloody theory about signs and signification, because he has two poles, the signifier and the signified. And if you do this, you can show that nothing means anything, that the whole system goes around in a big circle. 90 years before Saussure, Peirce, the inventor of pragmatism in America, had a different sign theory, which has three poles. That is, the sign, the receiver of the sign, and the ground upon which from which the sign grows. It's what Wittgenstein calls a language game, which Saussure leaves out of the question. The minute you accept the language game or the ground, you see that everything isn't floating around freely, but it all relates to the way that we understand one another. Because language is meaningless, except in the sense that we all agree to give it meaning. If the only way you could have a conversation with someone is to be hospitable, is to be friendly towards them, to try to imagine that they mean something by what they say, and then try to figure out what it is they mean. It's a spirit of generosity that's required in any kind of discourse. It's not a hard matter of fact. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but that's why I started writing, in order to get my thoughts in order, and in order to put them on the ground. And that is what the central chapter of this book tries to do. The question that interests me is, why does music take the forms that it takes? And is there a limit to the forms it can take? And if there is a limit, what is that limit? And what conditions that limit? That's what I try to understand in part of this book. And the other chapters of the book, they do draw on that thinking. All of them. They're sort of, the Sun Ra article, the Phil and the Residence article are case studies in a certain respect of that basic idea. And the basic idea is that it's a Kantian idea. You can't think what the brain can't. The brain is a mechanism that is not infinite. You are only able to understand things in the way that the actual mechanism of the brain will allow you to understand things. Everything is limited, and everything belongs to some sort of discourse, and the way you come to an understanding of things is by continually questioning it and continually defining what you mean by things. And this is why, if I have to ally myself with a philosopher, I ally myself with Ludwig Wittgenstein, because he's the guy who put this question most clearly on the table. He said, if you ask the wrong question, you will lead yourself around a maze from which you will never escape. The first thing to do is to ask the right question. And for me, the right question is the same idea as getting your feet on the ground. It's making sure that whatever idea you have, it's got a solid foundation.
I've got a question, Chris.
Yeah.
Not much a question, but an observation. In that, when I first read the book, you could, abbreviate to say it was the politicization of music in a certain way to bring music practice, and in the final coda, really, the listener as a participant. But I'm not saying but rereading it, there's a strong sense of a kind of Marxist paradigm in it, with means of production, means of circulation, the technology determining certain forms that music can take and things like that. So I was just wondering a little about that aspect.
Oh yeah, I'm not one of these people that says I'm not a Marxist anymore.
I'm not trying to expose you, Chris.
No. Karl Marx had a pretty good grip on things, and those are useful ideas that he had. And at this time, you were talking about the period in which this was written. Okay. Well, the period of the 70s was a highly politicized period in which, Italy was almost had a communist government. The Americans had to work really hard to fix the election, to prevent things from getting even worse from their point of view. There were uprisings. 68 was the year in which there were riots and demonstrations all over Europe, not only Europe, but actually all over the world. It's like 1848 all over again. Political thinking was really strong, and my whole generation, apart from the ones who were not bothered with politics. If you were bothered with politics, you were basically bothered with Marx or Marcuse or the Frankfurt School, or that's the language we all learned. So, and of course it liberated our thinking in one respect, and it caged our thinking in another respect. So it was a quite interesting process, breaking out of the cage. And this happened in two really strong... postmodernism, which I recently excoriated. Okay, postmodernism is the brainchild of ex-Marxists who were defeated on the streets of Paris and who retreated into their shells and said, actually nothing means anything. Actually we're not responsible. Actually we're not saying what's what anymore, because, this is where this whole relativistic form of thinking came from. It came from the defeats, because hippies were proclaiming peace and love and dressing up and doing interesting stuff and being allowed to do it up to a point. Then they started to get a bit political. Then it got very political. Then they started to throw paving stones. And the state said, okay, we've had enough now. We're stopping this. We're stopping this with the way we always stop things, with the army, with the police. And it stopped. And then there was a huge intellectual retreat. So a lot of people, a lot of the current generation of French intellectuals are right-wing ex-Marxists who just flipped over. But there's an awful lot of us who never flipped over. I mean, a sound analysis is a sound analysis. Because certain people drew certain conclusions, doesn't, you know, that doesn't invalidate. You have to go back. You have to go back to the source. If you go back to the source, you'll find that a lot of the things which are attributed to Marx, he never said. It's not as simple as that. He was a nuanced thinker. He's basically a philosopher-economist. Obviously, he didn't know what the modern world would be like. He completely missed the fact that mass media would make the mechanisms of power totally different from the mechanisms of power that he understood. He has nothing to say about that. You can't look to him for answers. But if you want to understand essentially how things work, then Machiavelli and Marx are two good places to start. And when I wrote this book, I was very much informed by that kind of thinking. We all were. And you see it. And in fact, one of the problems I have now with the necessity and choice chapter of that book is that it's too much focused on that kind of thinking, and therefore misses broader and actually deeper aspects of the analysis. You know, I did not understand when I wrote this that the key to the whole question was memory. See, I thought it was really much more to do with the means of production, and the forces of production, and the other. Okay, and which it is. It's not wrong in the same way that Ptolemaic astronomy isn't wrong in the sense that if you apply it, it works. But we don't think the universe is like that anymore. We've got another level. There's nothing wrong with Newton. You can use Newtonian mathematics and it will give you the right answer. But we now, we have a deeper understanding of things now.
Yeah, it's sort of to both you, Chris, and to the publishers, Ozren and Zoran, of translators, the people who worked on the book. Chris, you sort of said it was sort of, in a way, the book addressed a kind of vacuum, in some sense, of the kinds of writing that you're hoping to do. But I wondered if you could just, because I think this might come up tomorrow in the session about caesura, but I'm just thinking about, my question to you in a way is what kinds of publishing about music kind of was there in the 80s, and maybe you could maybe characterize that by saying what wasn't interesting, or what was definitely what you rejected, and maybe what was interesting, or maybe just more broadly, what kind of music writing or what kind of writing about music did influence you. And then I just wanted to say also, given that you've republished the book, now kind of how does that sit in the kind of landscape of publishing about music that, maybe isn't there or is there but is problematic? So it's a kind of double question to both of you.
When this book was written, popular music studies was a young discipline, and there were a few. Simon Frith was one of the early, but there was a whole bunch of the people who formed the Aspern. They were already doing that work. They decided that popular music was a topic worth studying. And you couldn't study it the way you studied classical music, which is Schenkerian analysis, which is a whole highly formal system. You can't analyze pop music very effectively in that way, and because it's not generated in that way. Schenkerian analysis is just reverse engineering, really. You're trying to figure out the process that somebody used in reverse. Well, pop music, which is much more intuitive, or at least at one level, you can't use those sorts of analyses. So there wasn't an academic discourse that was acceptable in which these things could be discussed. But the actual theoretical basis had to be forged by that generation of people who wanted to study popular music. They had to figure out, they had to legitimate themselves, basically, which meant they had to tie themselves to existing theories that would help, mostly sociological theories. I mean, if you look at the writing at the time, what I was writing against, in a way, it's sociological. Simon Frith has no comment about whether a pop song is a good pop song or a bad pop song, or interesting or not interesting. He wants to know how it functions in the society, how people receive it, what they think of it. He's neutral. He doesn't make value judgments on that level. Because as a musician, you want to make value judgments. You don't want to do stuff that's crap. So you need to know what crap is, and you need to know why you think something is crap. Because just saying it's crap is not good enough. That's like saying I don't like it, which is at one level perfectly legitimate. But the unexamined life is not worth living. So you want to try and, because obviously feelings are not there to be trusted. Stuff that you've inherited, it's all it'll do you good for a while, but at a certain point you need to question it, because people have given you opinions. People that grow up in a sexist society think women are inferior. People that grow up in a racist society think black people are inferior. And you can't blame them for it, in a sense, because that's how things are. When you start to question why, it's the same. I mean, with me, it was like that with religion. Okay, I grew up thinking, because I grew up in a school where you did religious studies, and you did every morning you had to say the Lord's Prayer and sing some hymns. So it was a fact of life. It's only if you start to question the fact of life that you might come to a different position. Academics, for the most part, are on a career track, and they are adding to each other's work. That means you need to know the authorities that they accept, and you have to cite those authorities, and you basically have to think the way they think. So, at the time this book was written, that's what was going on in music studies in general. It was the same as it had been since the late 19th century. And the young rebels who formed IASPM, who were trying to study jazz and pop, which jazz is part of popular music, were looking for different forms of authority, but they had to be academic forms, and they had to use the same academic language as their peers in order to be taken seriously. Otherwise, you were a journalist. That's what's going on. Since I didn't want to be part of the academic world, and I didn't need to do any of that stuff, my approach was different. Different in the sense that if you ask what musicologists or what musicology influenced my writing, I would say none at all. Marshall McLuhan influenced my writing. People like that, what we were reading in the 60s. Musicology really didn't have much to say to me because it spoke a language I, as a musician, didn't recognize. I said, they say I'm doing this, but I know I'm not doing this. They say this is how we work, but I'm doing the work, and I can tell you they're wrong. That's why it came.
So to get back the reason for publishing and the very process of publishing the book, Well, we didn't, so to say, we didn't refer to other music publication as this on our language, but we more refer to what we want to do. Since development of the very project, it was for the first time, I think, also the CUDA was somehow want to be directly involved within music, to do projects that would include music. So, and we thought that this book might be actually also a good starting point for us if you are to pursue projects in music and to develop develop that kind of the track that this could be actually a very good starting point to translate the book, and also then among us to open what we find important and to find our positions in that sense. So that's maybe.
But I would add just a bit related to this. I think Anthony also asked for something else, and I would actually just turn back in the 80s, then the circumstances when the book is actually come up, when Chris actually write, and then I can just turn back to my teenager and how I met, for instance, Tickmayer or Boris Kovacs or Oreško or other people. Then we actually share and play music. It's a question of completely different attitude and to understand, the fighting for your time and to play music. It's not, what we find in now. Then I would say then we are now just starting to be a very strong cultural periphery instead of the new circumstances of neoliberal, aspects. And that's one of the reasons why we actually create this needs to having such a text to reinstall some questions and to understand the situation where we are, because now then it's a strong pressure to analyzing, where is your nominal benefit of spending your time, and it's a question for us, and then how the people really invest some time in in a different process, and that's something that it was appear in our heads to think about this. And related to this, I think it's extraordinary for us. It's actually someone who is actually coming from direct practice, which is again important for us, which is direct. Substance, not to create of interpretation to an interpretation and so on. And that was actually the basic rule. But we could share other than maybe Neven could join us as well, or later on, just in his presentation, maybe we can learn a bit more about the circumstances from the 80s when the bourgeoisie was active, and how they developed the texts about music, who writing on the leaflets, and DIY literature which is come up and in this period. So that was kind of just the frame. But I just would like to argue in several aspects what we and why we actually find it extremely important to talk with Chris and to republish the texts in this particular moment.
It's a question about the title of the book. I find myself looking at it here in its new translation. Everyone, I hope, who is likely to read that translation will excuse me for reading it. Oznakom popularno. I'm wondering about what seems to me like a kind of double-pronged pun in that title. Like the first prong is a pun or a joke about academic writing about music, that it is written immediately to be thrown into an archive where it will never be looked at again, filed and disposed of and released into oblivion, perhaps in the process improving someone's career prospects. And you've spoken already about this direction of the, at least tacitly, polemical argument you were making about the scene of music writing into which you were intervening. But I wonder if there's another side of this pun too, which is about the way in which the music that you had been making had been defined, if not in academic discourse, then in journalistic writing during the period in which you had been making it. In other words, I can imagine at least that you, in the process of your activities, individual and collective, came up constantly against this conventional and sniping remark that it couldn't possibly be popular. And so there is another joke, perhaps implied here, that it is ludicrous for you, of all people, to be writing a book called "This is a Popular Book," or a book about popular music. And the pun becomes maybe even polemical or argumentative, in the sense that the title of the book says, well, maybe that's true, but I'm going to do it anyway. So in this sense, I'm just curious about where you think, having spoken already about your need for theory as a practitioner, where polemic and argumentative confrontation comes into your thinking about these questions, whether it has a place in your sense of what theory might be when it is produced by a practitioner, and also like how polemic or argument in relation to the concept or the idea of the popular animated your activity as a musician in the period before the composition of these essays.
I accept all possible meanings. I'm grateful for every new meaning that comes along, and I would not deny any of them. In my own head, Violander Popular is based on what they used to put on the back of albums: Violander Classical, Violander Popular, Violander Folk, Violander Jazz, and therefore it does contain all those possibilities. Exactly. Who's doing the filing? Yeah. As for, I have no. Apart from my brush with the Aspen, where I was tolerated, I have as much interest in the academic world as the academic world has in me. Like my hero Ludwig Wittgenstein, there are not, if you look at his books, basically, he cites no authorities, apart from St. Augustine, in one point. He doesn't feel the need to justify his position in somebody else's terms. And because I couldn't care less, in a way, maybe secretly somewhere, my psychiatrist will tell me that I could care less, but I don't feel the need to use academic language or to legitimate what I'm saying, nor do I feel the need to start from their premises or even to say that their premises are wrong. I just start from my position and work. I put my feet on the ground and work from there. And I say, essentially, what's wrong with my argument? Where's the fault? If you can find the fault, we can discuss it. But I don't need to find a fault with their argument in order to root my own in opposition to it. I think that's the difference, is that academics have to do that. I just read a very interesting book, which is written, it's a bit like the kind of Rosetta Stone of academia. So most of the book is written in plain English and is quite sensible. But at the beginning of each chapter, or rather no, it's at the end of each chapter, the author translates for the academic into academic language what he's just said, citing all of the correct authorities, quoting all of the... And it's really interesting. You see it. In the book, doesn't need it. It doesn't add anything to what he's saying, but it legitimates the book in that world. If you don't need to do that, and I don't, I'm not looking for a job as a professor of anything anywhere, it does mean that you can start thinking from scratch. I am aware of what they think. I have read their books. And I mostly think some things make sense to me, and some things I think, yes, well, it's logical, but the premises are wrong. You've reasoned logically, but your premises are wrong. You've come to the wrong conclusion. People who write about improvising, for instance, and there are many of them, mostly write things which improvisers find completely baffling. It doesn't relate to what they do, but it does relate to very sound psychological theories and sometimes some things you can identify with. But as long as you have these two worlds of thinking not meeting, it does mean that these sorts of ideas are not going to find their way into the public domain, because they are. Why would an academic read a book by a non-academic? And if they do, then it's journalism for them.
It's not counting for them.
Well, it counts, but it doesn't count as the work. It doesn't count as proper intellectual work, because proper intellectual work is showing that you understand where your thinking fits in the chain of thought, which is the discipline. It's possible to break. It is possible to break it, and the Aspen guys made a small break. They did carve out a niche for themselves, and it's worked for them. And the interest, what I say in my new introduction, exactly what happens is their first question was, what is popular music? And that's why I wrote that. Now that they have got their foot in the door and they're perfectly accepted as part of the establishment, they don't care about that question anymore. They never answered it, and now they don't think they need to answer it.
It's quite funny to imagine that they might come back to you to ask you what's unpopular. Come back full circle.
Popular and unpopular is not really, it's almost not a category anymore, because there is no mainstream anymore. You can't put things into these, if there's a mainstream public, like we had a program in England in the 60s called Jukebox Jury. So you'd have three people and they'd play a single and they would either say it's a hit or it's a miss. Okay? And everything was, Captain Beefheart's record was on that program because there was a mainstream culture. Everything was included. There were only 5 major record labels and they wanted to promote everything. Publishers sold best-selling books and spent their lost money on people they considered to be, proper authors, which they knew they wouldn't make any money on for the next 30 years. It was a patrician culture, but it was a culture that functioned in a way that, I, as a teenager, pretty much had a good idea what was going on across the whole field of music. File under popular, file under classical, file under folk, but it was all in the same shop. And you could go into the little booth and you could listen to anything they had. You pretty much had a grip on it. Nobody has a grip on anything now. Who knows about speed, math, doom metal? Hands up. You. Well done. So you're that's about, percentage-wise, that's about right. There are hundreds of communities and they all know each other and nobody else knows them. And so what's popular inside that little subgroup is popular. And it's, I suppose, by definition, not unpopular with everybody else. But, you know, since the language is now degraded to the level of the fragmentation of the culture itself, we understand what we mean by these terms when we use them amongst friends. But their grip on reality is slipping, don't you think? Popular, unpopular.
Just seems to be a good influence. I think popular and unpopular, like any categories, or the categories, to attack the categories is as much. Yeah, I'm not beginning to say what is popular.
Beyonce is popular.
Beyonce.
In other words, what's popular is what's most visible in what remains of the public realm. Okay, the death, speed, doom, math, metal guys are not in the public domain. In fact, metal, which is one of the biggest selling, most popular music forms on the planet, everywhere, Indonesia, heavy metal. 40,000 people go to the festivals. It's bigger than jazz. It's bigger than just about everything. You will read about it nowhere. It's repressed. It's denied. It doesn't exist. We don't take it seriously. What exists is what's in the daily papers, on the television, on the big advertising hoardings, in the cinema. That's what's left of mainstream culture. And so when you use the word popular now, its sort of generally accepted meaning is that. It's whatever the people that run everything want you to know about and want you to like. And a lot of people do like. What's amazing is that it works.
Got a question. Earlier you mentioned that you may have overlooked the importance of memory in our understanding of the different forms of music. I'm just wondering if you've written anything since this book, or whether you're aware of anyone else that has looked at that aspect of it.
Yes, I have, and nobody else has yet. I've been looking out for it. No, but yeah, I have. I've written. The main thing is on the MacBar website, where the programs are. It's called The Road to Plunderphonia. But in that essay, I pretty much reformulate in a more, in the sense of memory systems, which I didn't see when I wrote it. I mean, I got the picture, I didn't see all the way down to the bottom of it. So yeah, I have, and you can find it's free to download if anybody wants it. You just go to the MacBar site.
Just to information, MacBar is a Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona, and
yeah, because it's the biggest idea I had in my life, and I do want to try and nail it down. It's not fully nailed down. I mean, what really needs to be done is a proper analysis of the three. There are three basic forms. There's this memory, or this one you have here. There's this one, writing, and then in music there's sound recording. These are three totally different memory systems, and they are the negation of a negation. I mean, you can do all the analysis. Then you need to do the field work for each, for the forms of music which are mediated by each memory system, and how each one is the opposite of the one. Part of that work is done in the Plunderphonia article on the website, but there's an awful lot more to do, really. You need more case studies, you need to get down to the detail, but yeah, that's why I put the caveat in the introduction to this book, because you have to read that chapter with a generous heart and overlook its oversimplifications.
Oh boy, where do we start? I mean, this is quite a complex thing. I mean, I studied musicology at the Heidelberg University in Germany, and it was really obvious most of the time. They just analyzed things the way you described. It was more or less how the things were done, and it didn't change a lot at all in the past few decades. The first thing I wanted to ask you refers to that thing you said, that the popular music is intuitive on one level. You said at least on one level. I don't think... I mean, you probably said on one level, and I'd really like to know which level do you mean. And I have another question, but after you answer this one.
Well, sorry.
Up to a point, yeah, that's true. Up to a point, it's intuitive on a certain level. What do you mean by that?
If somebody sits down with a guitar and strums some chords and figures out a tune and thinks up some words, this is fairly intuitive activity. You're working from a contentious proposal. Music is a form of language. Academics don't like this idea at all. It's very unpopular. And if you try to map music onto verbal language, of course there are all sorts of things that don't work. If I say music is like a language, I mean strictly in the sense that in the same way that you're born into a world in which language already exists, and you learn it from the people who are using it, and you learn to use it the way they use it, and it means what they mean. That's exactly how you learn about music.
Could you say that there are academic musics which were popular back then and are considered academic musics now?
Well, there are musics which are non-intuitive. That's basically the entire canon of classical music, which was certainly popular. I mean, especially light opera. Verdi is super popular, but nevertheless, if you analyse Verdi's scores, they are correct in a musicological sense. They obey the rules, they investigate interesting byways of harmonic explication, they do variation and so on. In other words, they are because Verdi knew the rules and knew how to work the rules. He used the rules because they're useful rules. They enable you to produce work. This is why, in the beginning of the 20th century, Schoenberg, settled for a 12-tone serial system, because in the late 19th century, the rules had become so weak that common tonality didn't work anymore. You couldn't construct a symphony using common tonality because it was like a cliche. Everybody was using so many passing notes that you can listen to the whole of the beginning of lots of Wagner and you can't say what key it's in. So the rules were weak, and academic composers, or I might say not academic composers, what comes from the classical tradition of composition, which is analytical and mathematical and visual, it's all to do with quantizing on paper. That's what it's to do with. And that is a rational mathematical process. So you need rules, and you need to know what the rules are. Otherwise, your music becomes impressionistic, becomes like Debussy. You're starting to use a whole tone scale. It's impressionistic. There's nothing wrong with impressionism. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not rigorous. You have too many choices, even every artist of any, I think I can say this, wants to reduce the possibilities. I mean, the first thing you want to do is not to have to choose between an infinity of things. You need to set up a system of rules that make your choices quite small. Because when you have small choices, you can be creative. When you can do anything you like, it all just turns into mush. And that's what was happening at the beginning of the 20th century with music. It was turning into mush. And Schoenberg said, no, we want some rigor. We want some, and so we're going to do it by imposing this very, very difficult mathematical set of rules that you have to use every note before you can use it again. I mean, it's tough to work like that. So that's not intuitive at all. Whereas, jazz guy sits at piano, finds a nice tune. He doesn't need any restrictions, actually, at all, except what we would call taste. A sense of what's interesting and what's not interesting, what works, what doesn't. It's empirical, intuitive, empirical.
All right. Okay. Just the next one is not really a question. It's more of a remark. I haven't read your book yet, I have to admit it, but I've noticed at the end of the chapter 6 there is this discography addendum, and that's the thing you find most rarely in any of the academic books. When you write a musicological treatise of any kind, you at the end of the work you just put a list of the compositions you've analyzed, but you usually don't write it down as a record. You just name the publisher of the score. You name the scores. You don't name the records. So not any of the attention is being paid to who played or interpreted this very score, as if it didn't make any sense. And this very thing you did here is something you find really rarely in any of the academic writings, and I really like that. And that's the thing which changes the perspective, which shifts the perspective completely, because you name the records, you name the actual records being played by these very people, and that's the foundation of well, that's this chapter, I think, not the whole book, but the chapter 6, yeah, as I understand. And we've had numerous discussions there about whether just naming the score, naming the publisher, and listing the score as it is there any way for it to be viable in a sort of way? I mean, you're referring to a score, and the score is nothing. And there was this thing we discussed in March about what Evan Parker said about the scores. I mean, if the score is everything, then why bother playing it at all? And that's one of the main obstacles I find in Western musicology, at least in Western Europe. Only the scores are being... we're referring only to the scores.
Yeah, but it's obvious why, isn't it? Yeah. No, I mean, this is a 400-year-old culture. So there was no sound recording in 1500. So the only way... I mean, there are 3 ways of remembering music, okay? You remember it in your head. You write it down. Writing down is, if you remember it in your head, it will always change. Nobody remembers anything. Even the memories that you have of your childhood are mostly wrong. Because every time you open a memory, you reformat it, you change it. When you close it again, you save the changes. That's how it works. I mean, whenever I've had to put together people's recollections of what happened at a certain time. For instance, when I published some stuff by Faust, I went to all our members of the band and got them to tell me what happened. And they all had a completely different story. Of course they do. It's like Rashomon.
Mind-altering.
Because, their present lives redefined how they interpret their past lives, and certain things that shouldn't have happened didn't happen suddenly. It's all different. When you go back, when I did the same thing for Henry Cowan, I went back to my contemporary records. These I can't argue with. This was what we thought at the time. Everybody was astonished. They said, no, surely not. It couldn't have been. No, it wasn't. So this form of memory is highly unreliable. Basically, if you invent a tune, a little way down the road, it's not your tune anymore, and it's changed, and people have adopted it and taken it. This is how folk music works. Nobody owns it. It's passed around. Things effectively find their form in a kind of collective way. And they're simple, because you can't remember much that's very complicated. It'll all change. If you want polyphony, you need writing. So, the second way of remembering things, which is writing them down, has the great advantage of being very durable. That tune is not going to change in 500 years. The notes are telling you they're not changing. And the relation between the notes can be very complicated, and it won't be forgotten. And you can start to do things which, for instance, retrograde melody. Okay, no folk music has retrograde melodies, because people can't think backwards. But you can write backwards. Yeah. So when what we now call classical music, serious music, which is the kind of music people analyse, because nobody analyses folk music except now specialists who learnt about analysis through written music, and they are now projecting backwards. So the whole concept of musical analysis and the whole concept of mathematical thinking about music and ratio, all of that stuff, all comes from writing. So, of course, for Bach, wasn't even a matter of what instrument the piece was played on necessarily, because what was really important was the ratio, were the ratios between the parts, was the mathematics. It would sound beautiful on a guitar. It would also sound beautiful on a harpsichord, and so on. Because you're really talking about ratio, not about sound. As soon as you have a system of memory which is based on sound recording, the sound is what matters now. All the rest of it goes by the board. When you hear Frank Sinatra singing a song, it's Frank Sinatra singing a song. If you look at the score, there's no sound in the score. It tells you nothing at all. So what matters for popular music, and most popular musics as we understand them now, have grown out of recording technology and bands and going into studio and making stuff. And it's all done with the ear. The eye is out of the picture now, except on computer screens, but it's all done with the ear. So it wouldn't make sense to publish a score of a song, because what's interesting about the song is the grain of the voice and the way it's arranged and how it's the sound that's interesting. The score doesn't tell you anything.
Yeah, that's true. But we're surrounded by recorded sound, but the perspective on how we musicologically analyze music didn't shift at all. We return to the score every single time. And the thing we hear is not that prominent, not of that kind of importance as the score itself. And that's what happens most of the time.
Yeah, but it doesn't work.
Yeah. But try discussing that with a musicology professor somewhere in Europe. It just doesn't work. Yeah. Okay.
It was interesting in the early days of sound recording, really early days, cylinder days, when the first pioneers went out into the countryside to record folk music, because they understood that modernism was going to destroy this way of life and destroy this kind of music, and now they wanted to preserve it. You know, they were busy destroying it. They wanted to preserve it. They went out and recorded stuff on cylinders, and they came home and they transcribed from the cylinders onto notepaper and threw the cylinders away. They didn't understand what they had. They wanted to preserve the folk music, and the way they wanted to preserve it was to quantize it. So when they were singing eighth tones or natural harmonies, instead of, they would say, well, these are just primitive people, and that's, you know, they're singing wrong. You know, but so, you know, it's a paradigm change. You need to understand that sound recording has changed what music is, not backwards. I mean, written music is still what it was. You can still analyse Beethoven the same way. It works because that's how it was made. You know, all Schenkerian analysis is doing is reverse engineering something that was done. Okay, if you want to reverse engineer a Beatles record, you can't do it with notation. You need to understand what they did in the studio. How did they put the record together? Oh, look, they ran the tape a bit faster so that the guitar had a deeper tone. They were doing, that's, you know, they were basically saying, we want this to sound more interesting. We want this to sound like that. In a studio, that's what you say. You say, don't like the guitar sound. You know, I want the bass to be able, it's all about the ear. So you need new forms of analysis now, and they don't exist. As far as I know, I have never come across any equivalent to textual analysis in the world of sound.
There are attempts, but they are usually left in the background, and those people don't get to represent that way too often. Okay.
Okay. Now, I'm afraid that we have actually to stop now, because we have already 3 sessions more, but I'm very pleased to really share all those thoughts, and I think it's very interesting to continue maybe off the program. But first of all, just to thank you to be our guest the second time, and then I'm very, very happy then to having this to again questioning specifically in your last chapter, and as a very valuable question for us. And once more, then thank you for all of us.